Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Bitz about Bots, where I interview experts in the industry of intelligent automation and all things automation. Today, I'm actually joined by a guest who has more to share than our typical guest, and he's going to be talking about his evolution and background and how he wound up in this place called automation. So, without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and let you introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about where you're working today, and then we'll reverse engineer your history so that everybody can understand how it is that you wound up in this exciting career.
All right, so hello everyone. My name is Younis. I am currently heading the IoT team in Beiersdorf. We are German headquarter company in Hamburg. And my role specifically, I'm really covering more IoT topics that are related to manufacturing within supply chain.
And as such, we know that the supply chain industry or sector rather, in general, over the course of the last 4 years has seen a lot of changes with macro global effects, taking place, such as a war, a global pandemic that struck us all kind of silent and still all at once. And so there's been a lot of optimization and changes in this area that not only are manufacturers having to deal with, but on a smaller scale, some of the places that they're distributing to and how distribution centers are operating have also changed. So can you give us a little bit of landscape for those who maybe aren't in the industry, don't know the jargon, don't know exactly what's been happening, what you've seen as far as the evolution over the last 4 years?
All right, that's a really intense start. I would say Barsdorf, for those that are not familiar, is into the FMCG, so that's the fast moving consumer goods, and that really has a lot of dynamic shift when it comes to the pandemic and everything that surrounds it. And that's what you mentioned already. There's a big impact on supply chain, starting from raw materials availability, but also to how the consumers are buying their products. To top that off, there's been a lot of impact on raw material prices, which in turn impacted the cost of actually manufacturing the products. This is, primarily the key focus for supply chain is efficiency and how can you really get the product to the consumer with the lowest cost. And this is where it triggered a lot of optimizations that you would have to do in your processes and inside your manufacturing operations in order to offset some of that hurt that you're getting, but also to adapt to the changing consumer needs that are happening on the market.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. And I don't mean to have a heavy spirit, nor do I, enjoy having these discussions about pre and post pandemic. But I think all it did was refine our focus, right, on the fact that optimization must be front and center. And that, if ever there's a time to innovate and optimize the way that we operate, right, it's now because we never know what is going to happen. So in your experience, and I know you've had, several different flavors of your career, that have led to sort of this position that you've been holding over the last couple years. I think it's important, and we had a discussion earlier about how a lot of people wind up in this space from a variety of walks of life, right? And you sort of have a traditional background of sort of engineering, and then wound up in supply chain, and so you sort of marry that that understanding of how the engineering optimization and then the potential automation gains that you can make in the industry come together, and I think that's a really special blend. So tell us a little bit about your early career, how you wound up here, and it's always nice, and I always find it rewarding in what I do to evangelize the message of this being an industry and an area or career track for a lot of people to be able to explore.
Right. So I'm really an old school engineer. I'm a mechanical engineer by study. And this is where I really started. So doing a lot of mechanical engineering work that normally transitioned into more technical engineering jobs for mostly the manufacturing industries. And that goes into really design management, things that have to do with equipment design, equipment installations, and startup for new sites, new plants. That took me a lot around the world. And yeah, I would say I've done a lot of different products and worked with a lot of different technologies when it comes to the actual processes and manufacturing until maybe late 2016, where I started moving more and more into digital manufacturing and really looking at how digital solutions could actually improve the manufacturing as a total industry. For me, that seemed a very natural transition. I think during that early days, that wasn't quite so obvious, but it's year after year, it got more clear in my head that digitalization and digital solutions are going to become more and more prominent in the you know industry. When you talk about supply chain, being a very, let's say, technical and hardcore in that sense um, area versus other areas like finance or purchasing, where you have a lot of soft automation. I still thought you know it is going to catch up, and we're going to see a lot of more and more emphasis on that. And this is where I kind of shifted a little bit my focus from doing traditional engineering and more into the digital solutions. This carried me through from broad industry 4.0 discussions into really focusing more and more on what are the digital solutions that can optimize the current operations and also add capabilities for the actual supply chain in order to serve consumers.
No, and I think that's fascinating. And one of the things that we find a lot in the digital, in the digital software space, right? And really the digital transformation has so many different pieces of it, right? And automation being a subset of it. Really, your refined expertise and understanding the mechanics of what you call old school, right, looks like is what really primes you for a great position as a subject matter expert for those in your organization that are actually trying to digitally transform. So we talked a little bit about, at the end of the day, technology projects always have a cost. There's a budget, there's stakeholders, and there's beneficiaries. And when you're entering into something that you're going to transform within an organization, there's a lot of alignment that needs to take place. And not always are those that are setting the stage for the initiative the ones that understand how it should follow through. And not always are those that set the initiative are the ones that are ultimately paying for it, either by having labor come off the line to be able to help, understand what the current state is, or even optimize what the future state's going to look like and how the upskilling and the reshaping of the workforce is going to look. So in your unique experience, again, because you're an engineer, but you've got a lot of savvy soft skills that an old school engineer typically wouldn't have. So I loved your perspective, and when we first met and talked sort of about how you've helped with that stakeholder alignment, let's talk a little bit about how you've encouraged that at your organization, and then let's talk about what really matters, right, which is the dollars and cents, the monetary value behind behind or whatever currency it may be, right, being a global organization. But the monetary value of truly what you're putting back into the organization is ultimately what we're aiming for. So first, a little bit about the stakeholders, because I think you again bring a very unique perspective of kind of having hands-on keyboard, understanding the digitization, but also the subject matter expertise. And then let's talk a little bit about that three little letter word, right, ROI.
Yeah, let's park the dollars. If we park the dollars for a sec, I would really think the next key point is going to be understanding what are the key pain points that you have in your organization. Um, there is really two forces, really strong forces that I feel are pulling in general on any digitalization discussion. And the first force is there's really a lot of technologies and new solutions, and it's a jungle out there. And in a way, there are so many things that you can choose from and do. And there's a lot of very sexy, also very new high tech, edge things that you can bring into the organization. So that's from one front. There's this myriad of things you got to choose from. And on the other hand, you have inside the organizations, it wasn't so much at the beginning, but it's more and more that there is a pull and need for bringing in new solutions and the realization that we need to do something different. And I think the really key thing to do is how do we marry these two things together? Meaning, which areas do you really need to work on? What are your pain points from inside your organization? And then looking at all the available things out there and trying to see which one best, fits us best. And that equation is really very difficult. And when we talk about stakeholder alignment, I think bringing this clarity of first understanding what are really the pain points and where do they want to focus versus, let's go do everything at once is a really good start to the discussions. And then being able to really bring the outside in brings the additional value that you might not have with your current setup and the current organization and your current technologies that you deployed.
Absolutely. And I think once you decide what technologies you're going to deploy to, there's a need to understand if there's beneficiaries across the organization that could potentially leverage that purchase, right? Or that procurement option could be done once and it could actually solve a myriad of issues or problems or pain points or challenges that the organization might not have thought of, right, in a different way. And a lot of what we do too is centralize sort of that discussion with procurement, because often they get set off, on a wild goose chase to find a solution that's going to tailor fit, some challenge within an organization. And little do they know there's a capability that could perhaps, solve for or at least move the needle, in such a way that was already sort of procured and owned and operated by the organization. So there's a lot of discussion about centralization of digital transformation versus having it federated, across the different business units to see if it makes sense, right? We often hear about finance transformation. Well, what does finance transformation ultimately touch, right? If we're doing a supply chain transformation and the deductions that you're trying to optimize at the end of the supply chain don't get, married back to what, the CFO is looking to do in finance, well, have you really done a transformation, or have you tried to optimize a process? And so I really think, it's about kind of, pulling the lens back and taking a look at the organization as a whole to really understand where it is that value can come. Now, you mentioned something there that I think is really interesting, and I'm going to put you on the spot a little because we didn't talk about it before, but it's about sequencing, right? And so I shared with you, I have a process improvement background, and that comes screaming through in everything that I do. And I couldn't help but wonder, especially in supply chain, there's different elements and pieces within the end-to-end process, I'm sure, that you could choose and select to start with and maybe come back to and then maybe build around. So in a lot of instances, especially in robotic process automation and adjacent technologies, when we're looking at kind of the end-to-end process, there's different pieces that represent different levels of value, and therefore they're pieces that we develop and or begin with at the start of a project that maybe we would we'd put something else on hold or ultimately decide that it didn't need much of a transformation because it would cost more to transform than it would to to actually keep it as is. So in your world, can you tell me a little bit about sequencing, because I would imagine there's so many components and so many pieces of that supply chain puzzle, that you really need to kind of dig into the process itself, right, and understand what the implications of that transformation could have.
Yeah, I will try to give you a simple answer for a very complicated question, to be honest. So, I mean, looking at the way you carry out a digital transformation within supply chain, you would have to think of all the different areas within that. My focus is actually more on the manufacturing, so that's within the boundaries of the manufacturing plant itself. Even then, you still have many different areas that require different needs and different level of attention. And this is the way we've tried to think about it: is as you have the processes inside your manufacturing area broken down into these kind of areas, and then for each one you need to work hand in hand with the subject matter experts in order to identify what are the one or two or three top priorities, and what are the things that you really need a transformation in. And then somehow you need to work within a pillar system that you're aside from the needs of the individual areas, you still need to think about the overarching technical systems and the overarching strategic vision that you want to have. And that might be things like your architecture, might be things like organization, as you've mentioned, and what capabilities you need to build inside the organization, or even how the organization should be structured. It could be also upskilling. It could be a matter of even infrastructure that you need to do across. So somehow you have to bring these different streams individually, and then try to bring them together into and take into account how the overall picture looks like. And that is indeed a complex exercise to some extent.
Yeah, and I think it requires a little bit of top down, bottom up, right? Because there's no way that, executive leadership can make a decision on what makes sense to sequence if they don't really understand the implication of what that piece might touch,
Yeah.
downstream. And I think that's sort of more what I was after, is just, it really takes a committee, right? And it's a programmatic approach rather than looking at this as project to project. So in your specific space, you guys have done a lot of different, a lot of different transformations, a lot of different elements that you discussed that you are responsible for communicating back, right? And communicating sort of what the anticipated value of your projects within the program are, and then how that translates back to the balance sheet. Ultimately, at the end of the day, that's what we're all responsible for doing in a transformation. So where are some of the, if somebody is kind of, entering in this space or beginning, down the road of transformation, albeit any area, really. I think there's some principles. I think you named three or four, that you ultimately always have to kind of think through. And one being that communication, or that 360-degree kind of communication circle of making sure that everybody is aligned on what's taking place. But you also had mentioned making sure that as things change, because sometimes the way that you set out to do something may not necessarily be how it ultimately goes, or projects shift or priorities change. And you have to be able to be resilient and nimble in those instances too. So walk us through a little bit of a day in the life, what you show up to, and what you actually get, and some of the expectations you have versus some of the times where maybe you've had to change course. Because I think that's really helpful for folks to understand that this isn't, just a blueprint, not to use a manufacturing pun, but it's not just setting something up, right? And then saying we're going to execute it every time. In software, as in mechanical engineering, there's pivots and changes that need to be made. So I think it's important to highlight that, because it's not necessarily a failure if you move course, right? Sometimes that's what you have to do to succeed.
Yeah, I really think the times have changed, from really back in the days where you could do things on a 5, 10 year basis, and you could have a strategic vision that you go through and execute, or a project that takes, I don't know, 4 or 5 years, which is pretty well defined. You take a year in order to think through all your requirements, how you want to set it up, and then you go do it. I think these times are gone today, because the market and technology are moving so fast, and also the internal requirements and needs are also moving so fast. You don't really have the privilege of just doing that anymore. So there's a certain agility that is required in all the decisions that you're making, and uh, this bias for actually being flexible and how you're carrying out the projects. And that ultimately for me means one, fail and fail fast if you have to, and don't really do it over 2 3 years, do it over a week or two at this case. And then, and if you can get that right, you can at least get the first part of knowing is it the right direction or not. um, and the second part that I would mention would be and getting, let's say, the alignments and getting the right, because this atmosphere creates a certain degree of skepticism within the stakeholders as well. And this is where you need to create small success stories and then use them in order to kind of as an incremental stepping stone into something bigger, where otherwise it becomes really very difficult to get the backwind that you need in order to execute things. And I think the third thing that I would mention is when we're looking at all of these executions that we are doing um, across all the different areas, they need to still somehow be able to come back with the return, and that you're able to go back and say, well, I've executed this much from the journey and this is how much I'm getting back, and being able to say, well, this works, it doesn't work, let's move forward with a different thinking.
Yep. No, I think that's absolutely spot on. And I think you have to be, be able to fail fast, learn quickly, and rally the troops with momentum as quickly as possible. Because it's human nature to resist change, ironically enough, as we move towards this, this vortex of fast moving, AI coming at you, teachers wondering if they're not going to ever grade a paper written by a human again, and
Yeah.
to just, stop that skepticism and really embrace the innovation, we have to understand the rules of engagement, and they're not the same. No longer do you have a assessment project like you mentioned that takes a year and then an executional, due date of 4 years, after that. It's akin to no longer is it 3 generations building a pyramid in Egypt, right? To get that done, it's now, we have to get it done, in a timely manner. So I think that's true of that as well. So Unis, I just appreciate so much your time, and I really just loved everything that you shared. Is there anything that you'd leave as sort of a takeaway, or something that maybe that you've learned, throughout your extensive experience in digital transformation that you'd like to leave with everybody?
I would maybe just latch on your last point here. I think digital solutions do not have to be met with this sort of skepticism, especially when we talk about people losing their jobs. I think there is a very healthy way to move forward, a vision, let's say, where you can, where digital solutions are actually augmenting your everyday life, and also augmenting the everyday life of the operators, of the people sitting behind the screen, where you don't necessarily have to do all the mundane tasks, or you don't have to start from scratch. I do believe that we're far off from a day where, you know, all human intelligence is not required anymore. I think there is a big ground to cover there. And even though, you will have jobs that become redundant, that already creates a whole space and a whole range of opportunities for different kind of work, which I hope will become more meaningful. So to some degree, I'm an optimist when it comes to digital solutions, and I think even though we'll have our ups and downs, the trend is going to be looking up.
No, I 1000% agree. I think that was really well said. And I think, we'll let the robots and the machines do more of the robotic and machinery work and leave the human thinking and empathy and, those qualities that are very human to the humans. And I think we'll see more of that. Well, thanks again so much for joining me. And everybody stay tuned for the next episode of Bits About Bots. If you have somebody that you'd like to nominate to be part of the conversation, please feel free to nominate them below.
No, thanks for having me.